There is no surer pledge or dearer sign of this great hope in the new heavens and new earth in which righteousness dwells than the Eucharist. Every time this mystery is celebrated, the work of our redemption is carried on, and we break the one bread that provides the medicine of immortality, the antidote for death, and the food that makes us live forever in Jesus Christ. Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 1405.
In many ordinariate communities, the faithful customarily receive Holy Communion in both kinds, that is, both the precious body and the precious blood. Often those who have spent time in other Catholic parishes wonder about this and why it might matter. Some might find it simply strange. Others, formed by the Church's more traditional rites, may even worry that it is some kind of suspect modern innovation. In what follows, I offer both an explanation and defense of the practice in the context of the Divine Worship Missal. First, according to the Church's sacramental theology and canon law, one must have both bread and wine to celebrate the Eucharist. Bread and wine are the matter of the sacrament, and if I or any priest were to say the Eucharistic prayer with only one or the other, it would not be a valid Mass. Furthermore, the priest celebrant is himself required to receive in both kinds. These are not optional parts of the rite. The Eastern Christian rites have typically retained communion in both kinds for all the faithful. Many in the Byzantine tradition, the largest ritual tradition of the East, receive the precious body after it has been mixed into the chalice with a spoon. That rite uses a large yeasted loaf rather than the Latin-style unleavened bread. In the Latin Church, since time immemorial, unleavened bread has been used for the Eucharist, which lent itself to separate distribution. It's not clear exactly at what point the practice changed on the ground, but by the High Middle Ages, the only person receiving from the chalice was the priest celebrant, and this practice was solidified canonically at the Council of Trent. The vessels were consecrated and should not in general be touched by the laity. We might think of this as some kind of lay versus clergy principle, but it is just as much a practical matter. Communion from the chalice simply is more potentially difficult, and proper reverence towards the sacrament is likewise more difficult. Further, in theological terms, the Church understood, as she does today, that Holy Communion in one kind provides the full and complete grace of the sacrament. Practical and theological concerns combine towards a single discipline. Not only is general communion from the chalice unnecessary, it is undesirable. There were various reform groups in the 15th century who argued for a return to the common chalice. These cries were taken up by the Protestant reformers in the 16th century. While some of these reformers insisted erroneously that communion in one kind was not a valid sacramental reception, others simply disliked the apparent preference for the clergy and the idea that the laity were somehow unworthy to receive the chalice. The Council of Trent's decrees on communion in one kind were largely a response to these challenges. From the Council's teaching, we can glean two principal themes. First, no grace is lacking when one receives in one kind, because both the precious body and the precious blood contain the substance of Christ. Second, care of the chalice, like other consecrated things in the sanctuary, ordinarily rests with the clergy who are themselves consecrated for this ministry. This isn't a matter of moral worthiness, but of good order in the administration of the sacraments. In the 20th century, following the Second Vatican Council, the Latin Church began authorizing more widespread distribution of the chalice. This still varies considerably from country to country and diocese to diocese and even parish to parish. What has changed is not on a fundamental level the doctrine of the sacraments, but the Church's discipline on their administration. Discipline has changed historically and will continue to change in every age. That principle does not, however, require us to put on rose-colored glasses in reading the times. The new permissiveness around the sacred vessels has at times resulted in what can only be called liturgical abuses, the casual handing of the chalice from one person to another outside the sanctuary, and a lack of distinction between clergy and laity. I'm not here to defend those practices. Indeed, I understand why those attached to the more traditional liturgy following the Council of Trent might worry that a crucial part of the tradition has given way to Protestant practice. But the question is, do these aberrations and their problematic theology present the only possible mode of communion in both kinds? I think not. Promotion of reverence and sacramental piety is in fact central to the mission of the ordinariates. And despite the historical practice and theological difficulties involved, most ordinariate communities practice communion in both kinds. Why? There are two primary reasons, one cultural and one theological. The cultural reason in the ordinariates is simply that many of us were used to receiving in both kinds as Anglicans. Like it or not, we were and are children of the Reformation, even as we have entered the full communion of the Catholic Church. Pope Benedict, in welcoming us into the Church, wanted us to promote certain aspects of our patrimony. For many people, this is an important one, and one that frankly makes us a little different from your average Catholic parish in the 21st century. We normally receive communion kneeling, on the tongue, and we receive the chalice likewise kneeling. I cannot but wonder if this is part of the patrimony that Pope Benedict wanted us to share with the whole Church. Our practice demonstrates that it is possible to maintain reverence and traditional respect for the Eucharist while also restoring the chalice to the laity. The theological reason is given in our own ordinariate liturgical customary. Communion in both kinds more fully expresses the sacramental sign. Again, this doesn't mean that we objectively receive more grace, but on a subjective level, the level of visible things, through which Holy Church invites us to see invisible things, there just is literally more to see, more to experience. And this desire to do more than the bare minimum, is also part of our ordinariate culture. Catholic life isn't just about the minimum, but life in its fullness. And so we want to celebrate the sacraments whenever possible in a way that expresses that abundance, that overflowing goodness of God's love for us. When you receive from the chalice, it is important to help the minister guide the chalice to your lips by gently holding onto the bottom. He will not simply hand it to you. It's his job to hold onto it and protect it. But for basic visual reasons, you are better positioned to make sure the precious blood actually reaches your lips. For those who worry about lay hands touching the chalice, I would argue simply that this light, humble touch of the base maintains the distinctions promoted by the tradition. We already know in the prayer of humble access that we are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under the Lord's table, but his property is always to have mercy, and as such he has the power to make us worthy to receive him. Some people worry that receiving from a common chalice is unsanitary. Nothing is 100% risk-free, but tradition actually provides us with several aids here. First, silver, which usually at least lines the chalice, has antimicrobial properties. Second, alcohol, present in an accidental sense, also helps with germs. Third, a competent minister uses the purificator to effectively clean the lip of the chalice after each communicant. Put together, these are far safer than the common modern practice of receiving communion in the hand. And if you don't want to receive from the chalice, no one is going to make you. Liturgical law has made it very clear that receiving in one kind only remains the norm in the Latin Church. If our typical practice in the ordinariate varies from that norm, I hope only that it will serve to better illuminate the meaning of that norm and help all the faithful increase in love and devotion to our Lord in the most holy sacrament of the altar.
Holy Communion has a fuller form as a sign when it takes place under both kinds. For in this form the sign of the Eucharistic banquet is more clearly evident, and clearer expression is given to the divine will, by which the new and eternal covenant is ratified in the blood of the Lord, as also the connection between the Eucharistic banquet and the eschatological banquet in the kingdom of the Father. General Instruction on the Roman Missal, paragraph 281.